started Disney Month years ago now, specifically for this very moment. If all goes well, this should be posted on October 16th, 2023, which will mark the 100th anniversary of the Walt Disney Corporation. And while it's increasingly popular to shit on the company for their monopolizing of entertainment, it's hard to deny the impact that it's had on the general cultural environment, and, let's face it, the majority of us grew up with the company in one way or another. And to finally cap off the event known as Disney Month, once and for all, so it stops being an obligation to this channel to rush something out for it every year, I was going to try and release 2 countdowns for this occasion. But I doubt I'll be able to get both done by the date that I want to, so you'll still wind up getting this video nevertheless. Since this channel tends to dwell a lot in the programming you see on television to the point it's taken the form of my branding for this channel, and I prefer specifically animation to live-action television programming, in this video I'll be talking specifically about my top 10 favorite Disney shows. I won't say that I necessarily grew up with the channel as a whole. In fact, as a child, I spent more time watching its competitors, Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon more, and then by 2008-ish, my family stopped really doing much with television altogether. I still peek in, though, from time to time to pick up a series or so, or at least I used to, until I stopped having the time. And that's part of the reason why this channel is dead 11 out of the 12 months in the year. My main channel takes up a lot of my attention, but if you're still here in 2023, you probably already know that. In any case, my watch time is frankly scattered between 2 eras of the Disney Channel, and I'll fully admit I can be a little tunnel-viewed at times, so there may be shows not on here that I would also love to death if I just had the time to see. I hear some pretty good things about Amphibia, for example, so, you know, that might be something to look into. In any case, obviously I am only looking at Disney's animated programming. As much as I enjoy stuff like The Sweet Life or Hannah Montana, I just find I enjoy talking about cartoons more than I do live-action programming. That and, let's face it, after last year, animation needs more love. Animators don't get enough respect, good lord. I'll also obviously be excluding any acquired programming. Though, barring Shaun the Sheep and Braceface, I can't say I'm too familiar with much of that side of Disney anyway, so I guess we're not really losing a lot in that regard. That's not to say that their originals aired on other stations won't be considered for this list though, because a friendly reminder that ABC used to air a lot of Disney's older programming, and a handful of those are actually things I'm pretty familiar with, so I am including those. With that said, let's begin. I feel like it's kind of become a hot take now to say that I really like Star vs. the Forces of Evil. I mean, the ending did kind of sour it for a lot of people, and I can definitely agree that the ending to this show was a fucking disaster that kind of dropped the ball on what was otherwise a really good show. But let us not forget that there was a strong startup leading up to that. Star vs. the Forces of Evil was a really fun show overall with a really fun premise out of the gate. The lead of Star particularly was very enjoyable to watch for the first couple of seasons, and her chemistry with Marco definitely helped with that, obviously. Because for each crazy gremlin, you need yourself a good straight man, and I think they kind of both play that really well. One could kinda attribute the first season especially to some fantasy-themed early Rick and Morty shenanigans, what with the different locations and creatures we're introduced to. It's one of those kinds of shows that allows for a ton of creativity, and the show runs with it pretty well. Of course, as the series progresses, so too does what the show was about. Though, whether or not that's for the better is to be debated, because the first couple seasons and some change was a fun little scenario of the week where a character named Ludo is trying to steal Star's wand to take over the world. But over time, we start seeing more of Miss Heinous, also known as Meteora, the headmistress of St. Olga's Reform School for Wayward Princesses. Recurringly mentioned setting mentioned all throughout the show. And while I personally find her to be a bit hit or miss at times, like personally I liked Toffee as an antagonist better, but her antagonism existing, in my opinion, made for an overall net positive to the series as a whole that Ludo severely lacked on its own. It's overall a pretty good series despite what the ending did to it. I don't think that part can be overstated though, hence its placement so low on the list. Probably the weirdest entry on this list, Buzz on Maggie isn't one I think a normal person would call amongst their favorite Disney shows, but I never exactly claimed to be normal. Mostly because I think to most people the show is fairly mid and riddled with gross out that's usually pretty hard to do right, and while I won't deny there isn't a bit of nostalgia driving this particular entry, I don't know if I entirely think the common perception of the show is entirely fair. Mostly because I feel the show does something different to most of the shows like it. Sure, boyish shows targeted towards girls isn't an entirely new premise, not even in 2005. It wasn't even new on the network itself, like I considered Pepper Ann for this list as an example. But Buzz on Maggie taking it a step further and making the characters flies, you would think wouldn't come into play as much as it does, but it surprisingly gets brought up quite a bit, and in my opinion, that's really what makes it stand out to me in the sea of not like other girls kinds of shows. Now, sure, because of that, it definitely can be a little gross, though I'd argue that it's not as explicit as something like Mega Babies. I think comparatively, Maggie is a bit tame. But sure, it's a bit gross sometimes, but I don't know, maybe I just appreciate the detail. It also helps that the show in general is just kinda entertaining in its own right. Though sometimes it can feel a bit like the usual in its stories, the uniqueness of the theme and different approach to commonalities that we see in Saturday morning cartoons of its ilk definitely gives it a breath of fresh air that I think the genre more or less kinda needed. Especially during the time. For instance, the Jeremy episode is a good example of what I mean. Take the concept of bringing a stray into the family, a very common story for a show like this, but emphasize how the setting of the show is near a human household and the potential repercussions having a pet germ like that could have on the reputation of flies. It's a fun twist on what otherwise is a pretty played out cliche. I don't know, I always just kind of liked its approach. Recess is a pretty interesting show to look back on so many years later. While no, it has not always aged particularly gracefully, I think it does more right, and there is more that has aged well than things that have not. For a show that's as old as I am and that stopped airing in 2001, I think that's saying quite a bit. It gets labeled a lot as a surprisingly smart and deep show, but I don't think that's really fair to it. Like, other shows around this time also had the ability to be introspective and mature, even if they were targeted towards a younger audience. Look at Arthur as an example. But that's not to say that what Recess gives us is somehow underplayed because of that, and by no means do I want to understate that point. Recess is an incredibly smart show that approaches the setting and themes in a way that's mature enough to be riveting, but innocent enough that it still feels like a kid show, you know? It's believable enough to be immersive, but fantastical enough that it can still be enjoyable as a show set in the 4th grade. I think that's best encapsulated by the main characters and their interactions with those outside that circle. Normally in shows like this, you'd see characters that feel pretty one-note. You'd have the cool character, the know-it-all, the rebel, the leader type, and so on. And it's not to say that Recess doesn't still harbor those stereotypes. In fact, each of the main 6 kids all fit those bills to one degree or another. But what makes Recess stand out is that even the most cliché of trope gets layered with nuance and complexities that make them stand as more three-dimensional than the contemporaries. There's also that sense of loyalty amongst each other that the show gets praised for quite often, and really, how could you not? It gives the characters a common goal, it gives a sense of familiarity to kids, and all in all, it helps make the dynamic between the 6 very different characters more believable at the end of the day. I love stuff like Wander Over Yonder. Just adore it. Part of my enjoyment of Star Versus can be found here in that being able to see different settings and characters in each episode opens for a lot of variety and entertaining antics, and entertaining antics there are. However, this show isn't bogged down by strict serialization that drops the ball during the finale, because most of the continuity of the show stays pretty contained to callback humor or one-off continuations of previous episodes. It's not that serious, point being. Helps that if you like Craig McCracken writing, Wander Over Yonder has that typical charm you'd find in things like Powerpuff Girls, Foster's Home, and Kid Cosmic. So if you like the humor or characters of any of those other shows, it's definitely worth a watch. It's the only show I can say made me feel sorry over a fucking cube, so take that as you want. Now, you might have noticed me say specifically that the continuity isn't serialized most of the time, and that stays mostly true because it's very shenanigans of the week. It stays as such in a vacuum, but Season 2 plays to that strength in contextualizing everything around the conflict of Lord Dominator over the rest of the galaxy. then, like, the final 3 episodes or something hit us with that serialization hard. It's kind of funny. In any case, the show does what it does well in being both a humorous romp through the galaxy and a thoughtful story about how much you can do through positive influence. It's got that best of both worlds to it that makes the show so charming to watch, and despite the fact that it really looked like it wanted a 3rd season, I think ending it where it did was the perfect outcome for it. That said, I could have totally done with a Peepers and Sylvia getting coffee episode. I'm just saying. As easy as it would be to critique the show for its heavily reliance on formulation and repetitive story elements, there's obviously a reason why a show like Phineas and Ferb has stuck with as many people as it has. It's got a particular brand of familiarity to it that plays to its strength instead of using it as a crutch, as Phineas and Ferb uses its formula as a groundwork to build upon, and using it as a framework to create wonderfully imaginative scenarios that make each episode feel rather unique given its blatantly obvious handicap, giving us a plethora of deviations from said formula that just sucker punch a viewer with juxtaposition. This can either be a form of comedy or in the form of a whole story that hypothesizes what Phineas and Ferb's life would be like if the status quo truly wasn't God. It's these moments that truly stand out amongst the rest of the grain, but it's not to say that the rest of what we're given is any lesser because of it. For a show that's as predictable as Phineas and Ferb gets to be, its sense of humor is definitely something to be taken note of, considering most, if not every joke, seems to land in an impeccable fashion. And by that I obviously mean completely peccable. Is that how that bit works? Hold on. On that note, the characters are really what carry a lot of this show. It's a no-brainer how a character like Doofenshmirtz became such a lovable staple because of it. He's hilarious, and everything about him just brings a ton of memorable moments to the show, be it his entertaining one-liners, how good of a father he is, or just generally his hijinks from episode to episode. And it's not just him either, mind you. Candace, Buford, even Phineas and Ferb themselves all bring something fun to the rest of the show that even removing one aspect would make the rest of the show feel empty. It's a meticulous puzzle wrapped in an aluminum formula, and I mean that affectionately. Lilo and Stitch was a good movie that touches on family and how messy it can be sometimes. For 2002, it was definitely one of the edgier Disney movies behind the charming facade, and whereas the future of the movie looks grim and the animes, while I don't remember being awful, didn't particularly leave out on a memorably grandiose note, for like the 2 people who remember both of them, it had a good legacy in the Disney movie lineup. A lot of people liked it, and it's one of my favorite Disney movies, and was actually planned to be on that other countdown I wanted to release for Disney's 100th anniversary. But for now, we're not talking about the movie. We're talking about the show that followed the original movie today. A show that, in my opinion, followed up the release of the movie pretty cohesively. It's quite interesting to see what new experiments it wanted to introduce to us, what new scenarios they thought to play around with, and honest to God, what crossovers they wanted to get away with. This show definitely had the most interesting ones. Aside from the interesting situations and colorful characters that were introduced in this monster of the week, I just think generally the follow-up of everything was really good. The humor is on point with the movie. It's a brilliant continuation of it in just a general sense. And even if it doesn't get as dark as the original movie does, it's still pretty good at portraying familial ties in a fun way that fits with the situations that the various episodes portray. 2 experiments that could create an explosion can't reach each other. Lilo and Stitch fight like siblings. An experiment possesses objects and pins it on the family dog, showing that makes the family feel, while fantastical, still real enough to be believable. All in all, the show is very wholesome, very charming, and a perfect way to continue the legacy to the movie. So after I rebooted this channel, I started back with a review of DuckTales 2017, and ever since I've had a couple people tell me that I should revisit it. And I've thought about it. I definitely loved what came out after its shakier pilot episode. It got much better, really fast, with each episode giving us riveting adventures episode to episode. The characterizations of each character had been fleshed out in a way that the previous series didn't do, with Webby probably being the best example of that, but it's not to say the main 3 of Huey, Dewey, and Louie weren't also fleshed out for the better in the new show. In fact, the fact that we get to see more into their life through Donald and later Bella, the latter who only appeared in DuckTales comics, really helped it out the further we went into the story of the show. Also, unlike the previous iteration, the serialization is much more blatant, and so it spends more time telling a cohesive story than the original 1987 run. But what a story it is! Each season giving us a different narrative to pour our time into. Season 1's view of Scrooge and his estranged relationship with his family while giving us that nostalgia to the earlier series. Season 2's introduction of Della and the Moonlanders that follow, and capped off with Season 3's high-stakes adventures through the journals of Isabella Finch. The DuckTales 2017 reboot definitely went above and beyond with its plotline, giving us something that the 1987 run never did: consistency. And with that consistency, we saw sides of the characters in the world that we otherwise wouldn't see in something that was more episodic like the 1987 run was. Everything was just overall improved upon and resulted in an overall better product that I could not recommend enough, especially if you enjoyed the original run or the comics. You see, in most other circumstances, a show like Milo Murphy's Law would have been said to have fallen off after season 1, and if anybody wanted to say that, due to its over-reliance on Phineas and Ferb fan service and unfocused serialization of the Peanut People, while in any other show I'd say that's fair and valid and you have a solid point, I don't really agree with that in this particular instance. Milo Murphy's Law is a weird exception to a bunch of rules that I'd probably otherwise roll my eyes at. And while that might be in part due to me being as big of a Weird Al Yankovic fan as I am, I don't want to just overlook how many other great aspects of the show that there are. The show is really entertaining and subverts a lot of what we would expect in a show that was made by the very people who made Phineas and Ferb, taking a different approach than the formulation and predictability that permeated its predecessor. Sure, you do have the predictability of everything that can go wrong will go wrong, that's the premise of the show after all, but I find that it is a bit unpredictable as to what exactly will go wrong and how. Plus, there's the how of titular character Milo making the best out of all these bad situations. It's actually rather fun to see a character with so many bad things happening to him on a constant basis approach life in a rather positive and optimistic way. I don't know, I just always appreciated a character like that. It's a breath of clean air when you got the shining light and the darkness kind of character. I don't know, I've always liked it. Anyway, if you also like Phineas and Ferb's style of humor, it's not like much has changed in that department either. We just take the subversion sucker punches and replace them with genuinely good moments of comedy. And don't get me wrong, that's not to say Phineas and Ferb didn't have that, of course, but there were certainly a lot less moments where the subversion of tropes that was what carried the comedy to higher standards. That's merely it. Overall, I do wish the show got the love and appreciation Phineas and Ferb did from Disney, but alas, you can only do so much with executive meddling. Truly, whatever could have gone wrong did here. I just think it deserved better. Well, of course, when we get to the top 2, it becomes a matter of how predictable do I want to be, really? And the answer to that is, I'm a simple woman. I love Gravity Falls. This show has been brilliant since day one, and it's really hard to argue against that. Even back when I was a crudely drawn, blatant, mysterious Mr. Interclone, you could kinda tell that I didn't really agree with the handful of detractors this show had at the time. In 2015, I had called it the best show Disney had at the time, and while obviously I don't stand by that to the very last word anymore, being number 2 on my list nowadays, however, I'd still say that it's pretty close. Gravity Falls did everything as right as it possibly could have with the stringent censorship it faced, giving us a witty and subtly twisted world to explore with writing that is unironically some of the smartest I've seen in really any show, much less one aimed towards a younger audience. I'm not gonna lie, it was, I think, the first show I got impatient waiting for new episodes for. It's addicting. The mysteries interwoven into the story, the complex mythology that Alex Hirsch gave us, every last detail of Gravity Falls is fucking genius and showed that, even in the early 2010s, there was still an audience for an all-ages cartoon. A realization that seems to be severely lacking a decade later. We were given characters to love, a setting to care about, and a high-stakes, unforgettable story that few other shows are really able to compete with. If you have not seen the show yourselves, you're missing out on an, in my opinion, must-watch, and really only doing yourselves a disservice at the end of the day. But of course, we're not quite finished here, as this is only number 2. We do still have one more left to talk about before we can cap off Disney Month for good. But before I do that, let's channel flip through some honorable mentions I didn't quite get to. I don't have explanations for these. Well, I probably do, but I'm not going to in this video. But they were still ones that I had considered for this list, nevertheless. So, as much as I gushed over Gravity Falls, obviously it's not my absolute favorite. You know, obviously, here we are at number 1. But to understand the whole scope of my appreciation for number 1, you kind of need to understand when I got into it. The year was 2020, and a little series of books I had once loved started garnering a pretty significant negative reputation given its creator started parroting anti-trans rhetoric. And as I started distancing myself more from the series, Disney wound up serving to me on a golden platter what wound up being among my favorite animated programming, period. Not just from Disney. The Owl House is an amalgamation of the best aspects of modern children's programming, from its smart storytelling, its lovable characters, the sprinkle of humor that both kids and adults would enjoy, a magical world ingrained with an interesting culture and an even more interesting mythos behind it. The Owl House even explains its magic system in a cool and interesting way, like you wouldn't get that shit from Jowling, Cowling, Rowling. This show, like the previous entry on this list, did pretty much everything right, consistently, including LGBT rap, something that again was kind of needed come 2020. And it's not to say we didn't have LGBT rap up to that point. Of course, there's been queer characters forever, if you know where to look, and lest we forget that Steven Universe had carried that torch before the Owl House did by at least half a decade, and She-Ra by at least 2 years before it. But the LGBT rep in the Owl House is special, as it doesn't just become a side note at the end of the day. It's a part that's fully ingrained into the story and becomes driving motivation between some of the characters, something that not even Steven Universe or She-Ra had really done before it. So, it was pushing boundaries in that department, and I hope that does wind up inspiring other shows following in its wake. Because we needed a show like this in a world where people are starting to wake up to the existence of LGBT people. I don't know, maybe that last point is a little corny, but generally that's how I feel. It's a really good show, and the LGBT rep is just one of the many, many aspects that I could gush about over it. But to save on time, because I don't really have a lot of time to finish this video, I'm going to end it off here. I may have to come back to the Owl House in a future review, though. We'll see how I feel about that. Anyway, since that's the end of the video, I hope you all enjoyed it. What are some of your favorite Disney shows that I didn't talk about? Maybe it'll give me something to watch or review now that I'm done worrying about pushing out a half-baked review every year. Now that I'm finally free, maybe I can actually sit down and write reviews again. Who knows? I mean, of course, I've said that a few times now, and this channel is still rather slow to upload, so we'll see. Regardless, have a great day, and take care.